Congratulations. You wrote the fucking national anthem for stalkers and domestic abusers.
The event was supposed to be a celebration of hip-hop's cultural impact, a lively gathering of televised panels, captivating performances, and the customary scripted tributes that everyone had come to expect. But the moment Eminem and 50 Cent stepped on stage, it was obvious that this night was destined to be anything but ordinary. Their purpose wasn't to entertain. It wasn't to bask in the glory of hip-hop's legacy. No, their mission was far more incendiary. To dismantle the facade of the industry's carefully curated narrative, and they were doing it live, in front of millions. Eminem approached the microphone with deliberate steps, a folded piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand. His expression was unreadable, a mask of composure, but his body language screamed defiance. This wasn't about promoting a new record or reminiscing about the genre's golden years. This was about exposing a raw, uncomfortable truth. This was about laying bare one of the music industry's longest-running deceptions. Behind him, 50 Cent stood with arms crossed, his stance steady and unyielding. His gaze swept over the crowd like a hawk scanning for prey. He didn't speak right away, but the smirk on his face hinted at the storm brewing just beneath the surface. He knew what was coming and seemed almost eager to see the fallout. When Eminem finally slapped the paper against the mic stand, letting it dangle visibly for the cameras, the room seemed to hold its breath. "This," Eminem began, his voice cutting through the quiet murmurs of the audience, "is a list of every artist who should have won and every artist who won instead." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. 50 Cent chuckled dryly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man," he muttered, his voice tinged with equal parts humor and exasperation. "This has been happening for years." A ripple of unease spread through the audience. Some people shifted nervously in their seats, already anticipating the controversy that was about to unfold. Others whispered to each other, unsure what to make of the unexpected turn. The host, stationed off to the side, sat motionless, his expression caught between shock and dismay. This wasn't the carefully controlled, industry-approved homage to hip-hop they had planned. This was something entirely different. Something raw, unfiltered, and deeply unsettling. Eminem raised the paper, scanning the list of names with a steely determination. "They want to talk about hip-hop's legacy?" he said, his voice gaining momentum. "Fine. Let's talk about how they've ignored it for decades. Let's talk about the biggest names in the game getting passed over, time and time again." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They've always controlled the narrative. Tonight, we take it back." The crowd froze as 50 Cent stepped closer, his gaze locking with the audience. "You ever notice how some people keep winning over and over again, while the real ones never get their moment?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "It's like certain folks figured out the rules of the game, and the rest of us? They pretend we don't even exist." Behind the scenes, the production team was in chaos. Producers whispered frantically into headsets. The teleprompter remained blank, as if even the script itself had been stunned into silence. But it was too late. The truth was already loose, slipping through the cracks and spilling onto the stage. The bright lights above made it feel like midday, yet the air in the room grew cold. Nobody clapped, nobody laughed. Instead, a palpable unease settled over the crowd, a tension that made the weight of the moment inescapable. Eminem slowly tilted the piece of paper forward, ensuring the cameras caught every detail. He didn't need to explain. The names on the list spoke louder than words. Names of legends conspicuously absent from Grammy histories. Icons who should have stood in the spotlight but were left in the shadows. When Eminem finally spoke, his voice was measured even. It wasn't the fiery, shouting anger of someone just discovering an injustice. No, this was something colder. The simmering outrage of a man who'd carried the truth for years, waiting for the right moment to let it spill. "They've been doing this for decades," he said. "They lied to us. They use us when they need us, put us on stage, let us sell out arenas. But when it comes to the actual respect, the awards that really matter..." He paused, his eyes scanning the silent room before briefly meeting 50 Cent's glance. "They act like we don't exist." The audience stirred uneasily. Some leaned forward, their faces etched with curiosity, while others exchanged wary glances. Every word cut deeper. People understood exactly what he was talking about, but they had never heard anyone say it so bluntly, so unflinchingly. Eminem took a measured breath and finally dropped the first bombshell. DMX had the biggest rap albums of the year, twice. You know how many Grammys he got for it? He let the question hang in the air before answering his own question. 0? Beside him, 50 Cent chuckled darkly, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. It was a moment nobody in that room, or those watching at home, would ever forget. Eminem held the microphone steady, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "Say it again, man. Make sure everyone hears it," 50 Cent encouraged, his tone sharp. Eminem didn't miss a beat. DMX had the biggest rap albums of the year, 2 years in a row, no Grammys, not even a nomination for Album of the Year. His words hit the audience like a cold wave, a ripple of murmurs spread. Some had known, others hadn't. But now, nobody could ignore it. Eminem flipped the paper, letting his gaze settle on another name. Nas, one of the greatest lyricists of all time, didn't win a single Grammy for nearly 30 years. The silence became heavier, thicker. Snoop Dogg? 0 Grammys? Tupac? 0 Grammys? The crowd collectively inhaled, a sharp, audible reaction that mirrored their disbelief. "So don't sit here and tell me this isn't rigged." 50 Cent stepped up again, scanning the audience. His voice, calm but firm, echoed Eminem's anger. "They pretend like they respect us. They'll let us headline. They'll let us perform. They'll let us carry their whole damn show. But when the trophies come out," he shook his head, his frustration boiling over, "they find a way to give it to somebody else." Eminem nodded, his grip on the microphone tightening. "Every time." His voice dropped, measured and deliberate. "This isn't about me. It never was. This is about all the people they did this to before us and all the ones they're still doing it to now." For a moment, the stage seemed frozen in that silence. The weight of Eminem's words had settled over the room like a storm cloud. Then 50 Cent took a step forward, leaning into the microphone as if to press the point even harder. "You remember 2004? He asked, his voice low but tinged with a bitter edge. A few whispers echoed in the crowd. They knew where he was going. "I do," he said, shaking his head, his chuckle devoid of humor. "That was the year I lost Best New Artist to Evanescence." The room tensed again. This wasn't just about a loss. It was about the fact that 50 Cent's debut album had been a cultural phenomenon, one of the biggest of all time. And yet, when it came to recognition, the powers that be looked the other way. His words, understated but laced with years of simmering resentment, hung in the air, undeniable. Get Rich or Die Trying had flipped hip-hop on its head. It wasn't just an album, it was a cultural tidal wave, a moment in history. But when it came time for recognition, they handed the award to a rock band. 50 Cent's voice carried a mix of bitterness and clarity. "I knew right then, this whole thing is rigged." Eminem, standing off to the side, nodded silently, arms crossed. He let 50 command the floor, his expression saying everything that words didn't. "Now look," 50 continued, "I got nothing against Evanescence. But let's be real. Y'all ever seen a new artist blow up the way I did that year? My album, multi-platinum, my singles, everywhere. My music videos, non-stop rotation, and yet somehow, some way, they made sure I didn't win." He glanced over his shoulder at Eminem. "Sound familiar?" Eminem smirked. "Every year." The room had gone still. A tense, expectant quiet fell over the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement, while others, particularly a few artists standing at the back, stared down at the floor. 50 pressed on, his voice gaining momentum. "And that was just the start. You know what really showed me how fake this all is? My album, the same album that ran the whole year, lost Best Rap Album to Speakerboxx, The Love Below." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Now, I respect Outkast, but let's be real. Y'all think that album was really bigger than mine?" Gasps rippled through the audience. A few heads shook. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the question hung in the air, daring someone to respond. Eminem finally stepped forward. See, this is what they do. When hip-hop takes over, they shift the goalposts. When they can't deny our impact, they find someone else to hand the award to. 50 Cent nodded in agreement. Exactly. They'll let us sell records, let us break records, let us run the whole damn game, but when it's time to give credit, they look the other way. His grip on the microphone tightened as he took a deep breath. And the craziest part? It ain't just us. This is still happening. The audience remained motionless. Some nodded slightly, others sat frozen in place. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air. One thing was clear, this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was just the beginning. Eminem adjusted his grip on the paper, flipping it to reveal its reverse side. On the front, he had detailed the most notorious Grammy snubs, those glaring omissions everyone knew, yet never spoke about openly. On the back? A different story entirely. This side held the names of those who seemed to always win, the ones who cracked the code of the industry's unwritten rules. He held the page aloft, giving the cameras a long, deliberate look. And here's the other side of it, he said, his voice sharp. These are the people who learned how to play the game. The room shifted. Some audience members leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, while others leaned forward, curiosity flickering on their faces. Eminem's voice carried a calm intensity that cut through the tension. This isn't about raw talent. It's about who the industry decides gets to win, who they pick, who follows their rules. He glanced briefly at 50 Cent, who didn't miss a beat. And if you don't play by their rules, 50 chimed in, his voice low and cutting, you get nothing. Eminem nodded, his expression cold. Nothing. The host, who had spent most of the night looking progressively more uncomfortable, finally tried to jump in. But the Grammys have honored hip-hop, haven't they? He asked, his tone almost pleading. Eminem shot back without missing a beat. No, they haven't. He held the paper up again, shaking his head. They give a handful of trophies to the same people over and over. Then they wave it around and say, see, we support hip-hop. 50 Cent's smirk returned. But what happens when someone shows up who doesn't fit their mold? Someone who doesn't play their game? He asked, his voice dripping with irony. Eminem flipped the paper back to the snub list. They bury you, he said bluntly. The audience was frozen. This wasn't just an angry rant. It was an autopsy of a system that had quietly stifled artists for decades. It was a moment of clarity, delivered with the kind of unrelenting honesty that made everyone in the room reconsider what they thought they knew. They let a few through, Eminem continued, his voice steady. Just enough to keep everyone quiet. But if you're not what they want, if you don't play the game their way... 50 Cent finished the thought, chuckling darkly. You're done. A murmur rippled through the room. Some in the crowd turned to each other, exchanging knowing glances. A few nodded, their faces reflecting a quiet acknowledgement of their own experiences. In that charged silence, the unspoken became undeniable. They weren't just witnessing a critique of the Grammys, they were watching the entire system get laid bare. 50 Cent let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. And don't even get me started on who they hand Grammys to before the real hip-hop legends. Eminem smirked. Oh, we're getting to that. The industry figures in the audience felt it. This wasn't just a few critical remarks. This was a full-blown reckoning. As Eminem let the silence linger, the tension grew unbearable. People shifted uncomfortably, whispering under their breath, glancing toward the exits. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be the typical speech. Eminem was poised to take it even further. He lifted the paper again. And some people, he began, his voice steady, they figured out how to play the game perfectly. 50 Cent took a deliberate step forward, a smirk spreading across his face. Oh yeah, some people cracked the code. The crowd stiffened, collectively holding its breath. They knew exactly who they were talking about. Everybody did. Eminem shook his head, exhaling sharply. Look at Jay-Z. A few gasps broke the silence, but nobody dared speak. Look at Beyoncé, Eminem continued, his words measured but piercing. The murmurs began again, low and uncertain. Eminem wasn't pulling any punches, and the weight of the names he mentioned hit like a hammer. 50 Cent didn't hesitate. Jay, you know what I'm saying is true. You learned the rules of the game, and they rewarded you for it. He turned to Eminem. And I get it, man. You do what you gotta do. Eminem nodded. I get it, but let's be real. Do you think they ever would have let someone like DMX or Nas win over and over again like that? The silence was deafening. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Then 50 Cent dropped the line that would become the night's most shocking moment. You ever wonder why Blue Ivy got a Grammy before some of the biggest hip-hop artists of all time? The entire audience froze. Not a whisper, not a murmur, just silence. Eminem carefully folded the paper and placed it back on the podium. His next words were cold and final. That's the game, that's how it works, and everyone here knows it. By now, every camera in the room was trained on the stage. According to reports, Jay-Z and Beyoncé's reactions were caught off guard. Shock flickered across their faces as they processed what had just been said. 50 Cent scanned the crowd, his gaze steady. Some of y'all will act like you didn't hear this, like you don't see it, but we all know, and after tonight, nobody can pretend anymore. A heavy silence settled over the room. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The music industry in that moment felt permanently altered. The audience sat in stunned silence, the weight of the words spoken moments earlier still hanging heavily in the air. No one, neither the network, the industry figures in the room, nor the viewers watching at home, seemed to know how to process what had just happened. Eminem and 50 Cent hadn't simply criticized the Grammys. They had dismantled the entire system, live in front of millions. There was no way to undo it, no editing it out, no rewind button that could erase what had just unfolded. Eminem leaned against the podium, a long exhale escaping him. The job was done. He had said what needed to be said. But before stepping away from the microphone, he offered one final parting blow. We don't need your trophies, we made history without you. The words echoed in the hushed room. Then with a deliberate motion, Eminem pushed the paper aside, letting it fall onto the podium with the weight of a discarded contract. A statement that said more than any speech could. 50 Cent let out a low chuckle as he stepped forward. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on a few faces that refused to meet his eyes. Then he turned toward the cameras. Jay, man, he said with a quiet laugh, I ain't mad at you, but I'm not playing this game. And just like that, they left the stage. No encore, no final bow, just a clean break. Within minutes, the footage exploded across social media. Fans were deeply divided. Some hailed Eminem and 50 Cent as the realest voices in the industry, finally exposing the truth everyone had been whispering about for years. Others criticized them for going too far, for dragging Jay-Z and Beyoncé into it, for potentially torching every bridge they'd ever built. The debate raged on. The Grammys scrambled to respond, releasing a statement within the hour. They insisted that they had always supported hip-hop and pointed to past winners as proof. But their words felt hollow, almost desperate, because the damage had already been done. The audience had seen behind the curtain, and the trust was shattered. Reports circulated about Jay-Z and Beyoncé's immediate reactions. Jay-Z, who had once famously boycotted the Grammys himself, was reportedly shocked to find himself at the center of the storm. Beyoncé, known for her poise, reportedly stayed silent. But their responses weren't the most pressing issue. The real question loomed larger. What happens now? For years, artists had suspected the system was rigged, but no one had ever called it out like this, live and in the open. The music industry now stood on uncertain ground, trembling after the unfiltered honesty of that moment on live television. Eminem and 50 Cent had laid bare what many refused to acknowledge. Now, as the dust settled, the question on everyone's mind was, would the industry finally change? Or would it simply shift the pieces around, find new rules, and keep the game rigged in its favor? Only time would tell.